Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about a second Trump presidency. During Donald Trump's first term in office, which included an unprecedented attack on democratic norms, 2 impeachments, 88 criminal charges, a deadly insurrection, and the mismanagement of a pandemic that became ground zero for COVID deaths, the guardrails of our democracy remained relatively intact. The system held because civil servants put their loyalty to the Constitution over the whims of an erratic strongman. But this will not be the case in a second Trump term, which will be filled with loyalists cultivated by far-right think tanks. Over the last 4 years, these groups have been working diligently on a plan to remove the barriers that kept Trump in check, to give him unprecedented power over all branches of government, setting the stage for an authoritarian regime. That plan is the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. The Heritage Foundation is a right-wing think tank co-founded in 1973 by Paul Weyrich, most notable for bringing evangelicals into the Republican fold because they opposed racial integration. The Heritage Foundation was established to push pro-business economic policy as a response to the consumer, labor, and environmental protections of the 1960s and early 70s, and it was largely funded by corporations and wealthy elites most affected by the legislation, such as the oil and gas industry after Nixon created the EPA. Since its founding, Heritage has advocated for the elimination of the minimum wage, opposing unions, giving tax cuts to the wealthy, defunding the National Endowment for the Arts, and pushing school choice, which funnels money out of public schools and into privatized ones. In 1981, the Heritage Foundation drafted a 3,000-page, 20-volume document called Mandate for Leadership. They distributed it to Ronald Reagan and his entire cabinet, and it became their blueprint for implementing trickle-down economics. The idea that if you give corporations and millionaires tax breaks, it will trickle down to the rest of us. But the idea was unfounded. It was an economic policy that had never been proven to work in the history of the world. But more on that in another video. The point is that the Mandate for Leadership and its trickle-down economics was a plan to align the federal government with the desires of big business and the uber wealthy. This meant slashing budgets for government services that helped the poor and minorities and provided a leg up, like public education, Pell Grants, child nutrition, food stamps, Medicare, drug rehabilitation, charity hospitals, legal services for the poor, and unemployment insurance, all in order to give the wealthy and corporations massive tax cuts, which created the largest budget deficit in history, reaching some $100 billion a year during Reagan's term. Before Reagan implemented this plan, the U.S. had seen a period of unrivaled prosperity thanks to FDR's New Deal, which created the most prosperous middle class in the history of the world, where the bottom 90% of Americans reaped 70% of the rewards, creating the belief that each generation would be better off than the last one. But since 1980, America has been sliding back to Depression-era inequality in a period described as the Great Regression, history's fastest and largest redistribution of wealth to the wealthy. Today, the 1% possess more of the nation's wealth than the bottom 90% of families combined, returning the U.S. to levels of inequality not seen since the 1920s. Within the first year of Reagan's presidency, he implemented over 2/3 of the mandate's 2,000 recommendations, and Heritage even provided 11 staff members to the Reagan transition team. When Trump entered office in 2017, the Heritage Foundation provided him with an updated version of the mandate, along with 70 former Heritage employees for his administration and transition team. And just like Reagan, Trump implemented 64% of their policy recommendations in his first year in office. Just a few of the Heritage policies Trump implemented were repealing net neutrality, allowing tech companies to charge you more for higher internet speeds, restricting access to temporary assistance to needy families, overturning airline pricing regulations, cutting federal funding for interstate highways, cutting funding in half for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, eliminating the Minority Business Development Agency, eliminating the PLUS Loans program, ending funding for Common Core curricula in grades K through 12, eliminating federal loan forgiveness, phasing out federal housing subsidies, eliminating the Labor Department's Women's Bureau, cutting funding in half for the National Labor Relations Board, reducing funding for FEMA to respond to national disasters, eliminating disaster relief grants, and ending the National Flood Insurance Program, leaving the Paris Climate Accord to appease fossil fuel funders, as well as ending renewable energy mandates for federal agencies, ending global warming regulations on vehicles and power plants, and ending funding for the Global Climate Initiative, eliminating endangered species management, and restricting disability compensation for veterans. Now, the Heritage Foundation has released its 9th edition of the Mandate for Leadership, a 900-page document referred to as Project 2025. At least 140 people who previously worked for Trump were involved in drafting it, including Christian nationalists who believe in removing the line between church and state, and white supremacists who want to return the nation to the 1950s, if not the 1850s. The massive tome is the latest iteration of a 4-decade-long process of crafting right-wing policies to dismantle the federal government, deregulate industry, and eliminate consumer protections and public health measures, while installing a regime controlled by fossil fuel interests and the religious right. At least 100 conservative organizations contributed to Project 2025, and their names read like a masterclass in Orwellian language that means the opposite of what it claims. Here are just some of Project 2025's proposed policies. Cut Social Security and raise the retirement age. Cut Medicare and repeal Biden's drug price negotiation, raising the price of prescription drugs. Cut disability benefits for veterans. Eliminate entirely the Department of Education, Head Start, and free school lunches. Use taxpayer dollars to fund private religious schools and teach Christian religious beliefs in public school. Eliminate the Department of Agriculture's role in promoting nutrition and food safety. End the Affordable Care Act, which provides health care to 40 million Americans. Eliminate overtime pay and weaken labor laws to make it harder for workers to organize and form unions, thus depressing wages. Use the military to break up peaceful protests and bypass state governors to deploy the National Guard. Increase student loan payments and reverse Biden's student debt relief efforts. Defund the Department of Homeland Security, and prohibit the FBI from combating disinformation, allowing Kremlin propaganda to proliferate social media in a media environment where right-wing fake news outlets already outnumber actual news sites. Extend the Trump tax cuts for corporations and the rich while raising taxes on the middle class. Repeal the Inflation Reduction Act because of its landmark climate initiatives. Eliminate energy efficiency standards for appliances. Eliminate the Clean Energy Corps, gut clean energy programs, and slash funding for research into renewable energy. Expand fossil fuel consumption and Arctic drilling, and withdraw from all climate change agreements, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Climate Agreement. End birthright citizenship and allow ICE to conduct raids at schools, churches, hospitals, and playgrounds in search of undocumented immigrants. The mass deportation of 11 million immigrants to make America white again, using the military and National Guard to round them up into migrant detention centers. This new border policy would likely be even more inhumane than the last one, where Trump turned away asylum seekers and separated at least 5,000 children from their families and locked them in cages, of which 2,000 kids have still not been returned to their parents. Over 50 asylum seekers died in custody, at least 6 of whom were children, and nearly all of which were preventable. Eliminate federal agencies like the FDA, which would mean no more food safety inspections, the EPA, which means no environmental protection against polluters, and the National Weather Service, which means having to pay for weather reports. Remove banking regulations while also removing FDIC banking protections, which means any savings held in a bank will no longer be guaranteed if there is a financial crisis. Prohibit the Centers for Disease Control from attempting to control diseases, issuing health guidelines, and advising vaccinations for school children. End no-fault divorce, making it harder for victims of domestic violence to leave abusive relationships. Reverse the FDA's approval of abortion medication, ban shipment of abortion pills, ban birth control, and allow states to monitor women's pregnancies, and even prosecute women who violate abortion bans, pushing the U.S. ever closer into Handmaid's Tale territory. Erase the terms sexual orientation, gender identity, gender equality, reproductive health, and reproductive rights from civic discourse, paving the way to erase the civil rights of LGBTQ minorities and women. Allow the federal government to establish marriage between a man and a woman, ending marriage equality and reversing protections for gay, lesbian, and transgender people, once again allowing for discrimination and even criminalization. End diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. ban African American and gender studies in all levels of education, and ban books and school curricula about slavery, ban all pornography, require all U.S. ambassadors to resign so that they can be replaced by Trump loyalists, and remove job protections for government employees, giving Trump the ability to fire tens of thousands of workers without cause and replace them with loyalists. The Heritage Foundation has already begun a database of loyal right-wing recruits ready to replace them. You can even sign up on the website for training. Trump has stated that on day one, he's willing to be a dictator, and Project 2025 will help him do it. Once back in power, Trump would be free of checks and balances, so he could prosecute critics with impunity. He's already said that he'd seek retribution on anyone who's tried to hold him accountable for his crimes. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Raiklin, a former Defense Intelligence employee who hopes to be Trump's Secretary of Retribution, has already published a list of 370 political enemies to go after, including former presidents and their families. Trump would also pardon January 6 insurrectionists, validating violent extremists and domestic terrorists, which mean if they engaged in new acts of political violence, Trump could order the Justice Department not to prosecute them, in the same way that Hitler allowed his brown shirts to terrorize Jews and his political enemies in Nazi Germany. Trump has called for a 10% tariff on all imported goods, a 100% tariff on certain Chinese goods, or completely ending trade with China altogether, which would collapse the global economy. The tariffs from Trump's first term are estimated to have cost the U.S. $316 billion and over 300,000 jobs. According to Moody's Analytics, a second Trump term would fuel inflation due to his enactment of higher tariffs, as well as deporting cheap migrant labor and extending his tax cuts, which rolled back the taxes of billionaires to the 1910s and reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, shifting the tax burden from companies to the working class, who are now responsible for 86% of federal revenue. And Trump wants to slash the corporate tax rate even more, to a historic low of 15%, and gift $50 billion more in tax cuts to America's most profitable corporations. The Trump tax cuts added $2.3 trillion to the national debt, creating more debt than any non-wartime president in U.S. history. And congressional Republicans are already drafting up an extension for when he returns to office. Trump would also reverse Biden's economic policies, which have grown the economy to nearly 10% larger than it was under Trump before the pandemic. Under Biden, Americans filed a record-breaking 5.5 million new business applications in 2023, the third consecutive year of new business growth, and the highest on record, for a total of 16 million new business applications in 3 years. And Biden's unemployment rate averaged 3.6% in 2022 and 2023, the lowest since 1969. Meanwhile, Trump actually had the worst jobs record of any president, with more than 3 million jobs lost, while Biden has seen an increase of 6 million jobs. That's the 3 million Trump lost, plus 3 million more. And while inflation is still hurting consumers, it started as a response to the pandemic, supply chain issues, and the war in Ukraine, but it's now being fueled by corporate greed, as at least half of recent price increases have been caused by high corporate profits, otherwise known as greedflation, leading to the highest profits ever recorded and the highest profit margins in 70 years, using the cover of the pandemic to price gouge consumers. Unless Trump goes after the price gouging by his millionaire buddies and corporate campaign funders, inflation will not improve but worsen. In addition to weakening economic growth, another Trump presidency would also weaken what's left of the social fabric. When Trump entered politics in 2015, social psychologists noticed an increase in religious and racial bullying by adults, as well as schoolyard bullying by kids, caused by Trump's rhetoric. They called it the Trump effect. It soon led to an increase in hate crimes not seen in generations. In cities where Trump held rallies, hate crimes increased by 226%. White supremacists were so emboldened by his 2016 victory that in the 10 days after the election, there were 867 hate incidents that invoked his name. In 2020 and 2021, the U.S. saw more than 8,000 incidents of extremism and anti-Semitism. The number of FBI investigations into white supremacist and anti-government terrorism tripled during Trump's term to become the number one terrorist threat in the U.S. Trump inspires what's called stochastic terrorism, political violence encouraged and incited by his hate speech. Since Trump's election, his supporters have perpetrated attacks on Jewish synagogues, burned mosques, desecrated Jewish cemeteries, engaged in mass shootings of immigrants and African Americans, drove vehicles into peaceful protesters, plotted to kill FBI agents, shot up Planned Parenthood, tried to kill the Speaker of the House's husband, plotted to kidnap a governor, mailed pipe bombs to Democratic Party leadership, and launched an insurrection on the U.S. Capitol, where in total 9 people died, 140 officers were injured, and property damage totaled $2.73 million. And after Trump rebranded the coronavirus pandemic as the China flu, hate crimes against Asian Americans rose by 150% to nearly 3,800 instances in the first year of the pandemic. Since 2016, threats against members of Congress have increased tenfold. And in Trump's last year in office, homicides increased 30% from the previous year, a crime wave that did not recede until after he left office. And of course, there's Trump's own crimes. Trump racked up 88 criminal charges since leaving office, and he's been found guilty of 34 counts of felony for falsifying business records. Trump has been found guilty of fraud several times over and fined hundreds of millions of dollars. And 45 individuals serving in the Trump administration, campaign, and organization have been criminally indicted, racking up 335 criminal charges so far. Trump once declared that he would be the first person to run for office and make a profit, and he's lived up to that promise. While in office, Trump funneled millions of taxpayer dollars to his own businesses, pressured federal agencies and international organizations to do business with his personal enterprises, and invited foreign governments to pay millions of dollars to his businesses. He spent $500 million taxpayer dollars by frequenting his own golf courses and properties 285 times in 4 years. As a result, Trump earned $1.6 billion while president. And he swindled more than $250 million out of his supporters over false claims of election fraud, claiming the money would go to an official election defense fund, which didn't exist. Instead, he funneled the money to his super PACs and used more than $100 million of it to pay his legal bills. The year Trump was first elected, the Economist Intelligence Unit downgraded the U.S. from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. And after the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol, the U.S. was downgraded again and is no longer the world's oldest continuous democracy, but what's called an anocracy, a cross between a democracy and an autocratic state, marked by political instability, the subversion of the democratic process, rampant misinformation, and threats of violence. For now, the U.S. remains an anocracy, but if Trump and his extremists retake power, those days could be numbered. Project 2025 is the blueprint for turning America into an oppressive neo-fascist autocracy, where oligarchs strip the country for parts and corporations run roughshod, free of regulations, taxes, and accountability. If re-elected, Trump would appoint more radical partisan judges. He could share and sell classified secrets to his dictator friends. He'd turn back the clock on civil rights for minorities, immigrants, women, gays, and lesbians, stripping them of power and autonomy, and condemning them to second-class citizens. He's hinted that he'd ignore the 22nd Amendment and stay in office beyond his 2 terms. And the Supreme Court has essentially given him carte blanche to do it, granting this convicted felon the immunity of a king. If he returns to office, Trump will be more unconstrained, more emboldened, and more dangerous, and his acolytes will be far more disciplined. Many of Trump's first-term policies failed because our democratic institutions held. But if Trump is reelected, those safeguards will be removed. This time, Trump will not fail. But if we allow him another term in office, we will fail ourselves. If you enjoyed this video or know someone who would benefit from watching it, please share. And be sure to check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth. For an in-depth look at all the damage Trump wrought in his first term, please see my video on the first Trump presidency. And be sure to compare it to the achievements of the Biden administration in my other video. And thank you for watching.